All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Good afternoon. My name is J.M. Johnson. I'm a member of the Philanthropic Services team who helped produce today's event. Thank you for joining us, both to those of you who are here live with us in the Zoom room and to the many more of you who will be watching the recording afterward. Welcome. As we get started today, I have to acknowledge that this day feels extremely heavy on multiple levels. Today's Supreme Court ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade is incredibly consequential, from the most intimate and personal levels to the broad societal and governance implications that it has. We're gathering today to talk about everyone in our community having access to a safe and affordable place to live. This is a matter of basic justice. We live in a country that sadly and infuriatingly has decided not to positively affirm basic rights that everyone needs to have met. Among those, housing, healthcare, education, public safety, a livable environment, and the list goes on. It's truly awful to be in the position of lacking any of these necessities. It takes remarkable resilience to persist despite the structures and institutions that we and our forebears have created that inhibit everyone having these necessities. And while many of us on this call are privileged and lucky enough that many or most of our needs are met, it is still exhausting to constantly bear witness to the extent of preventable human suffering surrounding us that continues because of the active choices our society makes about whose experience to prioritize. Housing is essential. We know that a stable home anchors our health and provides a ladder for future success. Success in life starts at home for all ages and for all people. That's why, as the San Francisco Foundation has pursued our equity agenda, addressing our region's housing challenges has been a centerpiece of that work. We have taken an all-in approach to addressing housing issues through our various grant-making programs and initiatives. Today's event was titled Spotlight in Success: How Efforts to Prevent Homelessness During the Pandemic Paid Off. We can envision a different, more equitable way forward and are working to dismantle the unjust systems that keep some of our community members in a perpetual cycle of hardship. So in putting a spotlight on recent success, we are taking those glimpses that we've recently gotten of a better future and seeking to expand them. I'm thrilled to hear from our speakers today who are going to highlight a path forward for our community, a path that I'm very excited for everyone in this session to be walking together. This program is another installment of our Meeting the Moment series, which is formulated as a response to urgent events taking place around us, centering the leadership and voices of those in our community working to respond to those events. We aim to respond to questions from our donors and connect you with critical work that's supporting the Bay Area to realize its potential as an equitable, thriving community for all people. Though a virtual setting like this leaves a lot to be desired in terms of our ability to connect and enjoy each other's presence, we're here to have a real conversation, so I'm inviting you to be on camera if you're comfortable, and be thinking of questions that you'd like to ask our guests later on. The session is being recorded, so if you wish to be anonymous but would still like to participate in the conversation by asking a question of our guests, you can send those directly to me in a private chat. Before going further with the event, I want to pause to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of the various regions that we're calling in from. A land acknowledgement is an important first step toward working with Native communities to partner with them in their stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. We take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathering on as we seek to undo the intentional erasure of Indigenous peoples. We honor the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Today, I'm calling in from the traditional unceded territory and homelands of the Ohlone people. And recognizing that we are residing in the homelands of Indigenous stewards of this place feels particularly relevant as we think about today's topic of home and the urgent and challenging, yet solvable issue that some folks who are part of our community do not have adequate access to the necessary peace of mind and body that is provided by being at home. I am happy now to get out of the way and turn it over to our amazing guests to share their perspectives and insights from their work deeply rooted in our community. Christa, take us away.
Thanks, JM. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names on my Zoom screen. It really feels like my own coming home to be with so many of you. Before we jump into the panel, I just want to echo JM and take a little moment to hold space for today's news. As JM really mentioned, the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is not only a devastating setback for us as individuals, but also for our movement to end homelessness and poverty in this country. Today's decision will only worsen some of the root causes of homelessness, income inequality, and structural racism. Today's decision not only took the power of choice away, but could condemn many families into poverty. And history has taught us who this decision will impact the most: Black and brown women who had fewer resources and fewer choices to begin with. Ultimately, we cannot have economic freedom without choice, and there is no economic freedom without housing and safe and secure housing. So I just want to say a special thank you to this panel of powerhouse women for joining us today. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all. And also a special thank you to everyone for joining us for this next hour. As with everything that's happening in the world, we still feel this is an incredibly important conversation to be having. With that, I'll take a breath and turn us toward the panel. And I'll start by sharing just a little bit of background and context. Last January, volunteers fanned out across our region to engage in what is known as the point-in-time counts, or the PIT counts. This happens every 2 years when every county in the US conducts a count on a single night in January or in the early morning. And volunteers span out covering every block of our region, literally going out to count the number of unsheltered folks on our streets and in our shelters. We know these numbers aren't exact, they're not precise, but we also know they're important. They help shape our understanding of what's happening, and they help us understand the trends of what we're seeing in our community. The count in 2021 was delayed due to COVID. And so this count that happened last January was the first one that happened since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and is particularly important. Organizations on this call, including folks here in this room and many others, were watching closely and bracing themselves because we know the pandemic exacerbated so many of the inequalities we were already seeing. But we also witnessed so many of the folks here in this room and others springing to action and really working to pass protections, rent relief programs, to purchase hotels and motels, and to find solutions that weren't possible before. And so today we have a panel to really engage in that conversation. What did the numbers say? What are they telling us? What solutions can we lift up? What can we understand? And what calls to action does that mean for us to really understand in terms of investments? And so I am excited to introduce this powerhouse panel. Today we have some truly incredible folks with us. I'll introduce folks and then turn over to the questions. So I want to introduce Joanne with All Home. And All Home works to disrupt across our region the cycles of poverty and homelessness, and they work on this issue from all sides. They work directly with cities and counties to figure out what tools and resources they need to reduce the number of folks sleeping on their streets. They work on the policy side to make sure enough housing is produced. And they work on the economic security side to make sure everyone has what they need to not fall into homelessness. All Home played an incredible role during the point-in-time count process, coordinating across all of our region's counties for the first time in our history, so that counties weren't competing with each other, but we're instead lifting each other up, learning from each other, and figuring out how to coordinate across our county lines. I'm also excited to introduce Martina Cucullu from the Eviction Defense Collaborative. EDC works in San Francisco, and they coordinate a group of eviction defense providers across the city. And they also directly serve residents who are facing eviction, who are in need of rent relief, and those living in shelters. Martina has on-the-ground experience with what has happened in San Francisco over the last 2 years, and will share with us some of the highlights from San Francisco. Last but not least, we have Jamie Almanza from Bay Area Community Services, or BACS, which also serves as the lead agency for Keep Oakland Housed. And Jamie will tell us what she saw happen in Alameda County, and we'll dig into the myriad of services and supports that helped keep people housed during the pandemic, from rent relief programs to connecting folks with permanent supportive housing to end the cycle of homelessness. Before I turn it over to the questions and the panelists, just one last note as a moderator. I want to encourage attendees to put your questions into the chat. As JM said, you're welcome to chat the whole group or send JM a question directly. We'll be turning to your questions in the second half of this panel. And with that, Joanne, I would love to turn it over to you to start. They released these numbers in mid-May. What happened? What were the results? And what did you learn from this?
Thanks, Krista. And I want to just thank the San Francisco Foundation for having us all here today for this really important conversation, and for holding the space for how challenging both this day and the last weeks and months have been for especially folks like Jamie and Martina that are doing work on the ground, but all of us that do work in this policy space. So I wanted to say a brief thank you for that before we jumped in. And as we'll, I think, get into the conversation, we know that today's decision will have the greatest impact on the folks that we have seen show up in homelessness prevention and emergency rental assistance, predominantly being accessed by Black and Brown female heads of household. So all of these things are interrelated, and I think it's really important that we recognize that decisions like what happened today are going to continue to have a profound impact on our ability to deal with housing insecurity and poverty. So with that, I'll jump into the actual substance of why we all came together. And the results of the PIT count for the Bay Area really presented a rather mixed bag. The East Bay and San Mateo County in particular saw some significant increases in the 20 to 30 point range in terms of increase over 3 years ago. The rest of the region saw either modest increase, or in the case of San Francisco, even a slight decrease. And I'm not going to get into the exact percentages. As Christa mentioned, there was a great coordinated effort by the counties to release their information together, and you can find that in the link that gets dropped into the chat. But I want to focus more on the trends and why we think things played out the way they did. So the Bay Area really avoided what I think people were bracing for as a much more significant and even catastrophic increase in homelessness that was feared as a result of both pre-existing conditions prior to the pandemic, but certainly things that we think were exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think there's a few significant factors as to why those increases didn't materialize in the way we thought. And that really speaks directly to the fact that, the federal government stepped in, as did the state government in a lot of ways, with significant help during the pandemic, both in terms of cash transfers, direct cash transfers, like stimulus payments or tax credit increases, expansion of unemployment programs, but also with, as we'll get into, the really significant amount of emergency rental assistance that came into our communities through the American Rescue Plan. Coupled with that, there were some things that we don't usually see from government, which is a fast mobilization around getting people who were living in congregate spaces or even unsheltered into temporary housing while the pandemic was happening through a program called Project Room Key, brought people indoors, not everyone, of course, but many people indoors in a much more rapid fashion than has happened in all the decades that people have been working on homelessness in California. And then that was kind of followed up with a more significant permanent program called Project Home Key, which has helped to create more permanent, very extremely low income and permanent supportive housing units. So a big investment of state and federal funds infused very quickly into the system in a way that I think really prevented or blunted a lot of the really significant, and it would have been tragic, I think, response or what we would have seen if those things had not happened. Now, I would say a couple other things before we move on, and that's that although the numbers of the PIT count were better than we anticipated, homelessness is still the region's biggest challenge, and the roots of that problem well precede the pandemic. We know, for instance, that Black and Indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented in those who are experiencing homelessness by 5 and 12 times respectively. And that's not just a casual correlation. That's because we've had decades of systems and policies that have created the disparity. We've had unequal investment, and we've had disparate access to opportunity and resources for marginalized communities. So we know that the underlying causes of homelessness are structural racism, lack of affordable housing, lack of economic mobility for extremely low income housing. And the math simply does not work for poor people in the Bay Area. The lack of affordable housing for the lowest income households is the major reason why the Bay Area has the visible homelessness that we see and that we don't see in other parts of the country with lower housing costs. So California at this point is short 1.2 million housing units for extremely low income households. And the Bay Area alone has a deficit of about 200,000 households for that group of people. So until we recognize, as JM said at the beginning of the hour, that housing is a human right, we need to create it, and we need to be sure that people have access to it in ways that are not disproportionate. We are going to continue to struggle with the problem. The good news, however, is that we do know how to solve the problem. We saw that emergency infusions of rental assistance prevented a lot of homelessness during the pandemic. We quickly housed people. We prevented them from becoming homeless. We have a historic budget surplus right now. We don't see that surplus is being used to scale in the way we need on prevention and rental assistance. In fact, the proposed budget only backfills rental assistance in the state's program that has already been spoken for by people that applied through the end of March. So there was no additional investment to the program in order to keep people housed or prevent further homelessness. But we do see in places like Santa Clara County and in San Francisco, where the PIT numbers were lower, and there was a lack of increase or a more modest increase in homelessness, there has been investment that has already begun to bear results. These are investments in permanent housing and in rental assistance or homelessness prevention that started 5 to 7 years ago. So their impacts are starting to be felt now. And it underscores the need to invest in these kinds of proven solutions in order to make sure that safety net and infrastructure is there when the next emergency or the next recession hits. So I'll leave it there for now, and would love to hear what Jamie and Martina have to say about the pit count.
Thanks, Joanne, for that great overview of what happened across the region, really forecasting and talking about the catastrophe that was avoided and the work still to be done. Martina, I'd love to take this time to turn it over to you. Joanne mentioned that San Francisco's numbers actually went down despite being in the midst of an economic crisis and pandemic. And so would love to hear from you what you saw happen. And if you could tell any stories of individuals or folks that help illustrate what worked in San Francisco and what you saw happen over the last few years.
Oh, absolutely. Would love to. Before I do that, I do want to echo what Joanne said and thank the San Francisco Foundation, Christa and JM for organizing the panel and for this opportunity to speak with you all today. And I really want to thank all of you who are here today, and anyone who watches this in the future for taking the time to learn more about what is happening. So why did the pit count go down in San Francisco? And I will say I've been doing this work for a decade, and this is the first time I can say that there's been a downward trajectory in homelessness, which is amazing. In a word, or sorry, simply put, what happened in San Francisco is that there was investment in proven solutions. What are these proven solutions? We have tenant right to counsel in San Francisco. This is the result of the passage of Prop F in 2018. And Prop F is also known as tenant right to counsel. This was the result of decades of advocacy work with the tenants' rights organizations. What tenant right to counsel does is it guarantees that San Francisco tenants who are facing eviction have the right to full legal representation. Eviction Defense Collaborative is the lead agency that's overseeing the implementation of tenant right to counsel citywide. This is a critical program, and the expansion of tenants' rights could not have happened at a better time because it happened right before COVID. We were just into 6 months of tenant right to counsel when COVID hit. It's well known in the tenant rights community that tenants with an attorney have a better legal outcome. In fact, in recent years, the statistics have borne this out, showing that tenants with an attorney are 7 times more likely to avoid homelessness, which is not just a real impact, it's a tremendous return on investment. EDC's strategic approach to housing justice is rooted in the 3 Ps: production, preservation, and protection. Our work lies in the realm of preservation and protection. Eviction Defense preserves rent-controlled and affordable housing inventory by keeping tenants in place and preventing these units from being converted into market rate rents, which once it's converted to market rate, it is forever market rate. It will never again be affordable housing. Eviction Defense also protects the economic, social, and racial diversity of the city by keeping low-income and racially diverse tenants housed. As Joanne mentioned, it is San Francisco's Black and Indigenous population that are most impacted by evictions and the policies that are in place right now. In terms of what is it that we saw on the street, it was the confluence of the increased investment in tenant right to counsel months before COVID hit. So that was very fortuitous, as well as what Joanne said, a massive investment in rental assistance. And that is something that we are seeing continuing, and I'm very hopeful for that. But it's that combination of the eviction defense work and pairing it with rental assistance, which really made an impact in San Francisco. Why did it make such an impact if there's a moratoria, or there were moratoria? Well, the truth is that the moratoria didn't actually stop all evictions. In fact, all of the tenant right to counsel attorneys across the entire city of San Francisco continue to carry full caseloads during the period of the moratoria. The reduction in homelessness rates, despite continued eviction filings, demonstrates how effective legal representation in combination with rental assistance truly is. It is an indispensable tool in solving the region's housing crisis and central to an effective homelessness prevention strategy. TRC is currently the legal remedy for addressing the sharp increase in the number of eviction cases. With the lifting of the moratorium in October, there's been a steady increase in eviction cases that is now reaching pre-pandemic levels. When the state protections lift next week, all legal services providers in the TRC system expect the anticipated eviction cliff to arrive. And what Joanne was saying, we've been bracing ourselves for this moment, and it's about to come. And I say that with a smile, but I am not really smiling inside. While San Francisco and the state of California have increased the funding to support eviction defense legal services, the work is not yet fully funded, and we still need to increase the level of support that's available to tenants. In other words, this is a critical time, and those of us that are on the ground are in great need of flexible donor funding to help fund the expansion of this infrastructure. To give you an example, since the start of COVID, EDC expanded not just its its litigation program, but we also expanded our rental assistance program, doubling the program staff in order to meet the need and dispersing over $10.5 million in emergency rental assistance. This allowed EDC to build on the proven strategy of pairing eviction defense legal services with rental assistance. And that's the strategy that became even more effective in the context of COVID, which successfully kept thousands of families in their homes who may otherwise have been forced to move in the middle of the pandemic and potentially facing homelessness. One of the clients, I do have multiple client stories, but I don't know if there's enough time. So I'd like to share one in particular that I think illustrates the challenges that our clients are facing. During the eviction moratorium, there was a stark increase in the number of eviction filings where landlords were claiming a nuisance. And these filings were brought against some of the city's most vulnerable tenants who are residing in supportive housing. The majority of these tenants residing in supportive housing receive these particular nuisance-based eviction notices. The majority of these tenants were elderly and disabled tenants of color. In fiscal year 1920, the nuisance cases comprised 25% of all evictions. But in fiscal year 2021, that increased to 49%. And this percentage has continued to increase in 2022. EDC found that the majority of these cases have been filed in bad faith and are frivolous, and really just a means of sidestepping the moratorium. One client who was a victim of this sidestepping was such a tenant. One of the attorneys at Eviction Defense Collaborative represented a psychiatrically disabled tenant living in supportive housing. After only 5 months of living at the property, the landlord served her with a 3-day notice to vacate, claiming nuisance. What was this nuisance? Her abusive boyfriend. Her abusive boyfriend who did not reside in the apartment. Although she had ended the relationship, he was stalking her, repeatedly breaking into her apartment, stealing her, assaulting her at the property. She reported the abuse and the trespassing and the theft to the landlord, but received no assistance. The response that she got was an eviction notice. The abuse continued unabated despite her repeated requests for help and from the landlord and the property management company, including repairing a broken fence that her ex-boyfriend was using to enter into the property. Instead, what happened in supportive housing was that she was blamed for creating a nuisance, which led to this eviction filing. EDC's attorney launched an aggressive defense, conducting extensive discovery, interviewing witnesses, and collecting evidence. Finally, several months after the initial filing, the EDC attorney successfully negotiated a settlement whereby the tenant was able to stay in her home and remain stably housed. Additionally, while the case was pending, our social work team connected this tenant with increased mental health care and resources. I want to thank you for letting me share about this client and about this work. this work is very near and dear to my heart. As I said, I've been doing this for over a decade, and to see that the solutions that we've been proposing for years are actually working is very exciting. And we are really excited about what's happening on the ground level right now. San Francisco is very fortunate to have the tenant right to counsel system at this critical time, but we need further investment from the philanthropic sector to meet the need that is growing every day. Eviction defense and rental assistance are proven solutions that work. We just need to expand the capacity so that all the tenants needing these services can access them. That I do have time. If there's time for another client story, I'm happy to share. I just don't know if there's time for another story.
Martina, I would love to circle back to that shortly. I want to make sure we get Jamie in here as well.
Great.
We were already starting to hear about, first, thank you for lifting up the stories and what you're seeing on the ground. It's so important to remember the humans behind the numbers that we're talking about. We're already starting to hear about some solutions. Joanne mentioned building enough affordable housing. We heard from Martina about legal services, well-funded legal services, and emergency rental assistance. Jamie, I would love to turn it over to you to talk about what happened in Alameda County, what you saw, and to lift up any data or stories that you want to preview as well.
Of course, thank you so much. And Martina, I want to hear the other story, because I think what you just said is it's the same story. And I think for our, our partners on the phone call, it's the same story, right? And so it's our charge and our edict to really kind of persist through the bureaucracy that in some ways kind of gets in the way of serving the same story overall. So I just want to echo what Joanne said and Martina said around just today and just the struggle, coming to work today, honestly, but also I think for BACS, so we're an organization, so we do every line of business, prevention, we do interim housing, street outreach, and we do all the way through like permanent housing, like helping people actually who are living on the streets get into housing. So what Martina said and what Joanne said around the prevention thing, I don't want to repeat it, but we for BACS, we've served over 6,000 households through like San Francisco Foundation support and other foundation support and donor support and all home support to, really infuse money into the household so that people wouldn't become homeless. So that's the first step, right? But I think to not be repetitive, I want to focus on, so a major part of what BACS does, and we're in 7 counties. So we're in San Francisco County, Alameda County, Contra Costa County, Solano County, greater Bay Area. What I want to focus on is the people that we all are visibly concerned with, right? So it's like you walk to a restaurant and you step over someone and they're struggling. BACS, that's actually predominantly who we serve. So we have a number of programs who we can go out onto the street. You'll never see us. We don't have BACS t-shirts on. And so that's one thing as a person, that's not tied to the services. You don't know what's happening, but we're engaging with someone and we're like, hey, you want to come in tonight or no? Or do you want a sandwich? Or do you want, do you need socks? Whatever it is, right? And then but that's not it, right? It's what we call progressive engagement. So then we help them make the, ultimately say like, come inside, right? And we're going to help you come inside. And then, so we do a lot of what's called interim housing, which the All Home Plan has kind of the steps in terms of like, prevention, interim housing, permanent housing, and beyond, right? So we do a lot of that. And then the thing I want to uplift is one of the things we do is we buy single family homes. And not a lot of people know this, but as a nonprofit, we'll buy a home, right? So it's like a 5-bedroom home, 4-bedroom home, and we'll move people into that home. They each have their own bedroom, own lock and key, they share amenities, and they pay us affordable rent, say like $500 a month for to live in that home, right? We're the landlord, and we're also the service provider, because a lot of people have a lot of complexities, and will end up that's their home for years. And I think that's one of the things that I want to uplift in terms of kind of what we're doing to get people, people off the streets per se, and how to create community, how to create very much efficient alternatives to what can take, sometimes it takes 10 years to build a big building of affordable housing, right? So all of us can't wait for that. So that's one of the things we're doing. We are in the prevention spectrum, we're in the interim housing spectrum, and I know we're in interest of time, so just happy to take anybody's questions.
Thanks, Jamie. Really appreciate that. And would love to open it up to the full panel and encourage attendees to post their questions in the chat, either directly to JM or to everyone in the group. But I have a few questions to start out with that have already come in or that we're asking already. The first is really to everyone. What did we learn from these numbers across the region? What are we learning about the moment in time that we're in and what we need to do moving forward? Joanne, maybe I'll start with you and then welcome anyone else to chime in.
I think Jamie just referenced our regional action plan. I mean, we've been calling with a group of regional leaders from the public sector, the private sector, philanthropy, the nonprofit world, across the 9 Bay Area counties for, a 75% reduction on sheltered homelessness in 3 years is the goal. But in service to that goal is getting all those players aligned to make concurrent investment in interim housing. Yes, we need that, but that's not the answer. The answer is permanent housing. So we actually need double the investment in permanent housing to what we're getting in interim housing solutions. And then we need 4 times the investment in prevention. We need to stop the inflow of people that are coming into the homeless response system, because San Francisco is a good example. They are housing people. They are housing a lot of people. They are creating a lot of permanent, supportive, and affordable housing. But until recently, until this very recent period in time, more people flowing into the system than they've been capable of rehousing. So it seems like the numbers are showing that the investments that they have been making, as Martina said, and I do think right to counsel coupled with rental assistance and the Prop C funds that San Francisco has, voters have passed, have made it's a game-changing difference to have a well-resourced system that can do multiple things at once. And we're not seeing that in other jurisdictions. And part of that is, they are under-resourced. Some are, in more recent times, passing local initiatives the way San Francisco has. Santa Clara County has been a leader in that as well. But those are the kinds of things that need to happen. It's not an either or situation. You can't kind of put your finger in one hole in the dike and expect the leak not to spring in another part when you're choosing between proven solutions that work, but they need to work together.
And Joanne, if I can just interject as the service provider on the ground, it's interesting because we're in 7 counties, right? Some counties are steadfast in like prevention, right? Or some cities like Keep Oakland House, we've housed 6,000 or kept 6,000 households served and spent $32 million in rental assistance. They would have been people that would have ended up into street homelessness, right? But to Joanne's point, there has to be a holistic view of all of the components of all home, which is it has to be prevention, interim housing, permanent housing. And then there's other cities or counties where we're going in very strong and we're doing a ton of permanent housing, but not prevention. And so I think for the, the constituents on the call, it's like, wherever you see yourself, and we have donors where we have a lovely man who he's like, I want to buy a house. I want to put, not buy a whole house for backs, but I want to put 50,000. He's an Oakland school district teacher. And he was like, I want to put $50,000 of a down payment on a house in Oakland. and I was like, and we toured it and we bought a house, and it's like 5 people are housed now permanently, right? So wherever you are in the spectrum of kind of keep people housed, get people off the streets very quickly, which is the interim housing intervention that I was talking about, or the permanent housing, like there's room for everybody, right? And so I think that's to Joanne's point, but every city and every county and the politics play out very differently. So as a constituent in your hometown, wherever it is, make sure you say all of them, right?
Yeah, I want to jump in and just echo everything that is being said. I Keep Oakland House has a very soft spot in my heart. I was a part of that initiative, and I just love hearing about how it's succeeding. It makes me just so happy. One of the things that I think we've learned, and if we hadn't learned it during COVID, I certainly, it was double down on learning it today, is we can't rely on the courts only to guarantee our human rights. Protection means policy work. And tenant right to counsel, this was the result of decades of advocacy. Keep Oakland House is the closest thing in the East Bay to tenant right to counsel. And the only reason it doesn't exist is because there isn't a law for it. There isn't a policy in place for it in the East Bay and Alameda County. And so I think one of the things that I've learned is that we really do need investment in policy and policy initiatives, and that policy must be informed by the work that is happening. As Joanne and Jamie said, we know what works. We just need the money to be able to do it. That's all. Like, we got you. We will do it. We are ready. We know it. We know how to do this. We just need the resources to be able to ensure that everybody has a right to housing. So that would be my lesson learned.
Thank you. This is so, I feel like I should just put you 3 in charge of everything and we'll figure it out. We just need to invest in this group together.
I'm game.
Well, we could run the world if all of you will elect us 3, but it'd have to be all 3 of us.
Yeah, together or none. We have time for one more question before we close. And I want to ask you all, what calls to action do you have for this group? We've heard some of them already, investments in specific areas and all of the areas, but I want to give a moment, whether it's policy, whether it's giving, like what calls to action, what can we do to help address this challenge as members of this community? Jamie, maybe I'll start with you and then pass it background.
I was going to go in the same round robin with Joanne and then Martina and then me, but it's all 3 of us if you think of it. So it's like Joanne, all home, right? And it's like global policy, right? And then it's like Martina, like thinking about the courts, and that's policy, advocacy, and service, right? So that's the midway, and then we're all service, but we're all contingent on all of what I just said. So I guess I would say wherever you are in the spectrum as a person, that whether it's saying like I'm going to write a $10 check to X, right? Or I'm going to go to my city council and say, around the eviction protection stuff. Or I'm going to go to my council and say like, okay, all homes coming and saying we're doing this regional plan. Or for me, for backs, I would say it's kind of like, hey, if I have money, if I have resources, if I have neighborhood sway, whatever it is, it's like we're the services people. So it's like, it could be writing the check. It could be let us buy a house in your neighborhood. It could be, oh, so are you a realtor or are you a landlord? Are you a landlord that might consider, with our support, taking people in? Or, I think I just, there's every person on this call, there's something for everyone. And what, money or no money? Money's always great, but no, whatever. Yeah, so I'll pass that over.
I would say, I mean, I think there's a lot of different policy calls to action, right? You know, and one of the biggest things is, you know, we have to have a different way of funding our response system. It can't be dependent on one-time investments when the state government has a surplus. I mean, we know California has boom and bust cycles, and we as service providers and as policy advocates need to be speaking about a fully funded system at scale, whether that's a right to counsel at the state level, whether that's ongoing funding for homelessness prevention or anti-displacement work. And certainly we need our safety net to be able to be responsive when anyone hits a housing crisis. It shouldn't be like, oh, your community can help you if we happen to have money left over this time around. And you know, some jurisdictions, as I said, have gone that extra step and put their own local initiative in place to have an ongoing local source of funds, but that doesn't exist in most places. And so I think policy and advocacy is really a key to enabling the system to be responsive and have a level of certainty that doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, I want to echo that. And what I was thinking about when you were talking, Joanne, is so we do have tenant right to counsel in San Francisco. It's amazing. It's fantastic. It is also an unfunded mandate, which means there's no pot of money that is obligated to be utilized for this work. And so it goes to what you were saying is the goal is steady, stable housing. You cannot achieve that goal without stable resources. It's just an impossibility. And so I echo everything that's been said, but I will say, you know, to try to be a little bit more succinct, something my son always asks of me is invest and encourage your network, your friends, and your family to also invest in these solutions. It's not a one method, one solution works. It is a complex problem that requires multiple solutions working in tandem. And we have proof that it works. It's just about steady, stable resources.
Can I please hire your son to work for me tomorrow? Is he 11? Which is would be fine.
He's 7.
So I think he needs a few years, but I'll let you know. He got a job on
Please,
today.
give me his respect. But I think your point. So to the people on the call that are understanding why we, you know, everybody walks outside, including myself, and they say, why is it getting worse? Right? There's money coming down from the state, the counties, the cities. To Joanne's point, so as an organization like BACS, we used to only contract with counties, and then we started contracting with cities. And certain cities are saying, like, we're going double down, you know, with the counties, with the state. And those cities are stepping up, and other cities, you know, are still in pre-contemplative stage. But then the counties, it's interesting because it comes down, I think there's a very challenging political structure, right? So it's like, we've all read the books, we see the articles, and then me and I'll just leave with this, as a nonprofit CEO, I've been doing this work for 22 plus years, believe it or not, right? And I even in the last 2 years have been like, am I doing the right thing? Am I moving the needle? And I came back to this of it's turning into, and we're all services. I saw 3 clients this morning, and all of the clients I served this morning were like people you would appreciate that I served and we saw, but we need to push the political structures that Joanne was talking about in terms of like, is it city council, board of supervisors? Is it the policies that Martina was talking about where, you know, I have a colleague who used to work in San Francisco and she was like, what do you mean they don't have right to counsel? And then she came over here and they don't have right to counsel for the eviction defense stuff, right? And I was, so, you know, we are all empowered to solve this issue, and it's not just money. It's you being a constituent and saying like, and I guess my call to action, going back to your question, Christa, in terms of, it's like, don't get tired or get like what's the word, like you know, devalued in terms of seeing the person on the streets, because we all are as service providers. And actually that's the call to action, is like, you know, helping us, helping the nonprofits, helping the policy advocacy associations, helping the foundations. Like, we're all still in it and and it's very hard because we're all seeing the same thing. So I would say, however you can help, there's a moment in time where you can help.
If I may,
I feel like, oh,
I could jump in with one
Sure.
quick thing.
Yeah.
For helping all nonprofits that work with government funding, policies that change the reimbursement policy. Right now, nonprofits that are funded by the government, we have to fundraise to float all of the costs to vet and then get a reimbursement. All of the funds are encumbered, there's compliance issues. And so helping us with changing the way that funding works is huge. And that's policy.
Well, and I will say, I mean, BACS and EDC are fantastic organizations, and they have the ability to work in that system because they do have enough infrastructure to do it. There's a lot of Black and brown, well, not that you do, but you find a way to manage working within the constructs of it. I'm not saying it's fair and that it doesn't need to change, but there's a lot of small organizations out there that can't even access, and they might be the organization that is the most culturally appropriate to be working with a particular group of people. But they're not going to get access to the city and county contracts in the same way because you know, they don't have the ability to manage all the compliance and
Exactly,
the fronting of costs that
and we would love as organizations to even support that. And so it's like, even that, I think your point is so valid. Yeah.
I feel like we could talk all day, and I would love to talk all day about this. And in fact, we'll talk about this all day, but I unfortunately have to close this out. But know the conversation will continue. I just want to appreciate everyone for hopping on this call, for learning with us and digging into the numbers. As Jamie mentioned, walking around our community, it can feel overwhelming and like it is getting worse. And in the midst of all of that, it is so important to recognize the victories that we have accomplished together, that we staved off a catastrophic increase in homelessness that was feared because of the immediate reaction of the federal, state, and local governments and community members like you calling for rental assistance, for eviction protection, etc. We also know that the enormity of the challenge remains, and that homelessness, as Joanne said, is still our region's biggest challenge, and it was our biggest challenge long before the pandemic. And so we started today by talking about a choice, and we know we have choices now. We know what the solutions to homelessness are. You heard many of them on the call. There's no one silver bullet, but we need to invest in things like prevention. Research shows tremendous public cost savings to the public if we prevent folks from becoming homeless in the first place through legal services and emergency rental assistance. We heard about building more affordable housing so folks have interim and permanent housing to get into off of the streets. And we heard about policy and systems change, thinking about everything from contracting structures that Martina mentioned to the policy change and right to counsel that help folks stay housed and make sure they have access to a safe and affordable place to call home. With that, I'll turn it over to JM to close us out with the 2 minutes remaining, and a huge thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you, Christa, and thank you so much to our guests for sharing your decades of extremely important work and experience to inform what our donor community can think about, how they lend their abilities, their resources, their passions to engaging as a community for solving these challenges that we're facing. I think Christa gave a great recap of some of the takeaways, and just the last thing I will say on that is the thing rattling around my mind is that all of our systems and institutions were designed by humans, which means they can be redesigned. So we just have to ask ourselves what kind of society we want to live in. It's our choice whether to invest in redesigning our systems and institutions to prioritize an equitable society or to allow those inequities to persist. So you'll see in the chat, we've prepared some giving recommendations, and those will be emailed out as well. I know I'm holding and you are all holding that we are living in a rapidly changing world that presents quite a constellation of complex and difficult issues to hold and to live with. Yet we're in this moment right now where we can advance policies that are truly transformative for our future. So with your resources, you can support housing organizations and advocates who are advancing these solutions that we've talked about today at scale, so that everyone in our community has access to safe, reliable, and an affordable place to call home. One more final thank you to our guests. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to those of you who are listening after the fact. And we look forward to continuing walking this path with all of you together. Be well.
Thanks so much.